Imagine for a moment that you are facing one of the most feared armies in ancient history. A wall of spears that are 20 feet long moves toward you. The ground shakes under the feet of thousands of soldiers marching together perfectly. This is the Macedonian Phalanx, the same battle formation that Alexander the Great used to conquer the known world. For more than 100 years, no army on earth could stop it when fighting it head-on. But on a cloudy morning in the year 197 BC in the hills of Thessaly, this unbeatable army would be tested like never before. What happened that day would forever change military history and decide which power would control the Mediterranean for the next 600 years. This is the story of the Battle of Cynoscephalae, where a secret weapon destroyed what seemed impossible to destroy. If you enjoy fascinating stories about battles that changed the world, subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. To truly understand what happened on that battlefield, we must first travel back in time. We must go back more than a century to understand exactly what made the Macedonian Phalanx so special and why it was considered completely unbeatable. The story begins with a man who would forever change the art of war. His name was Philip II of Macedon, father of the legendary Alexander the Great. When Philip became the Macedonian king in 359 BC, he inherited a weak, divided kingdom that was constantly threatened by its neighbors. Macedonia was looked down upon by the great Greek city-states of the south. Athens and Sparta thought the Macedonians were little more than barbarians from the north, but Philip had a vision. He had spent years as a prisoner in Thebes during his youth, where he had seen military innovations firsthand. There he studied the traditional Greek phalanx, a formation of heavily armed soldiers who fought shoulder to shoulder with spears and large shields. But Philip saw the problems with this formation. The shields were too heavy, the spears were too short. The formation was too stiff, so he began to imagine something different, something revolutionary. When Philip returned to Macedonia, he started a military transformation that would shock the ancient world. He completely redesigned his army's equipment and tactics. The main innovation was the sarissa, an extremely long spear that was between 18 and 20 feet long. To help you understand, traditional Greek hoplite spears were about 8 feet long. The sarissa was more than twice that length. This meant Macedonian soldiers could hit the enemy from a distance that made it almost impossible for the enemy to hit back. When the Macedonian phalanx moved forward, the first 5 rows of soldiers could point their sarissas forward, creating an absolutely impenetrable forest of spearheads. The soldiers in the back rows held their spears at high angles, ready to bring them down when needed, and also to block enemy arrows and javelins. But the sarissa came at a cost. It was so long and heavy that soldiers needed both hands to hold it. This meant Macedonian soldiers couldn't carry the large round shields that Greek hoplites used. Instead, they used a small circular shield called a pelta, which was strapped to their left forearm. This shield offered limited protection but allowed both hands to handle the massive sarissa. Armor was also reduced to make soldiers more mobile. The phalanx soldiers, called phalangites, wore lighter breastplates, simple helmets, and leg guards. Everything was designed to create a war machine that focused on range and attacking power over individual protection. Philip's genius wasn't only in equipment, but also in discipline and training. He transformed the Macedonian army into a permanent professional force. The soldiers were no longer farmers who fought occasionally during the summer. They were warriors who trained constantly, perfecting the coordination needed to keep the phalanx formation under any circumstances. Keeping a perfectly straight line while carrying a 20-foot spear and marching over uneven ground required a level of discipline and teamwork that few ancient armies could achieve. The Macedonians trained for this over and over until it became second nature. The typical phalanx formation was deep, usually 16 rows deep. When fully formed and moving forward, it showed a wall of spearheads that stuck out several yards in front of the first line of men. Facing this moving wall of metal was terrifying. enemies described it as approaching a seemingly endless forest of spears. And behind this forest were thousands of men marching in perfect unison, pushing forward with unstoppable force. The physical pressure of the rear rows pushed the front rows forward, creating momentum that could cut through almost any enemy line. But the phalanx did not fight alone. Philip was too smart to rely on a single tactic. He developed what military historians call a combined arms system. On the sides of the phalanx, he placed the elite Macedonian cavalry, the companions, who were heavily armed horsemen on powerful horses. These cavalry units were personally commanded by the king or his most trusted generals. Their job was to protect the phalanx's vulnerable sides, and at the decisive moment of the battle, launched devastating charges that would break the enemy lines. Light infantry units, including archers and peltasts, armed with javelins, operated in front and on the sides, harassing the enemy and protecting the phalanx as it moved into position. This combination of different types of troops, each with its own specific role, created a military machine of unprecedented efficiency, and it worked spectacularly. Philip used his new army to conquer all of Greece. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, the Macedonian Phalanx crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, the two greatest military powers in Greece. It was a shocking display of military superiority. The Greek city-states, which had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries, were humbled by this northern kingdom they had previously looked down upon. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, his son Alexander inherited not only a kingdom, but also the finest military machine in the known world. And Alexander would use this inheritance to achieve conquests that still seem nearly impossible today. In just 13 years, Alexander conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen. He defeated the vast Persian Empire, conquered Egypt, marched to the borders of India, and founded cities that would bear his name throughout the known world. And in each of these conquests, the Macedonian Phalanx was at the center of his strategy. At the Battle of the Granicus in 334 BC, the Phalanx held the center, while Alexander led his cavalry in a decisive charge. At the Battle of Issus a year later, they faced vastly superior Persian infantry and utterly destroyed them. But it was at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC that the Phalanx demonstrated its supremacy most dramatically. On that plain near the Tigris River, Alexander faced the largest army ever assembled by the Persian Empire. The Persian king Darius had over 200,000 men, including fearsome bladed chariots, war elephants, and the elite Persian cavalry. Alexander had perhaps 50,000 men. The Persians attacked with everything they had. Their bladed war chariots advanced at top speed, designed to cut through enemy lines like scythes through wheat. But the Macedonian Phalanx simply opened gaps in their formation, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly between their ranks, where they were destroyed by the reserve infantry. When the Persian cavalry tried to attack from the side, they were held back by the Macedonian cavalry. And in the center, the Phalanx continued its unstoppable advance, marching forward with their sarissas extended, smashing everything in their path. The battle ended in a complete Macedonian victory, and Darius fled the battlefield. The world's greatest empire had been defeated by a military innovation that fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire was divided among his generals in a series of brutal wars that would last decades. These generals, known as the Diadochi, his successors, fought fiercely for control of different parts of Alexander's empire. But they all had one thing in common: the Macedonian Phalanx. It was the basis of all their armies. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from this period, including Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, and the Kingdom of Macedonia, all based their military forces on the Phalanx. Throughout the 3rd century BC, the Phalanx continued to dominate the battlefields of the eastern Mediterranean. But while the Hellenistic world was absorbed in its own internal wars, something was changing in the West. A new power was emerging on the Italian peninsula, a city that would begin to project its power far beyond its original borders. That city was Rome, and the Romans were developing their own military system, which would be tested repeatedly in the brutal wars of the Italian peninsula. At first, Rome used a Greek-style phalanx, but the conditions of Italy, with its rugged hills and constant fighting against diverse enemies, forced the Romans to adapt their tactics. The Roman army underwent a gradual transformation over several centuries. Around the 4th century BC, the Romans began to abandon the rigid phalanx in favor of something more flexible. They developed the maniple system, where the army was divided into smaller units called maniples. Each maniple had about 120 men and could move independently. This allowed the Roman army to adapt to terrain and circumstances in ways that the rigid phalanx simply could not. The maniples were organized in 3 lines, the hastati in front, the principes in the middle, and the veteran triarii in the rear. This 3-line formation gave the Roman army unprecedented depth and flexibility. The individual Roman soldier, the legionary, was armed very differently from the Macedonian Phalangite. He carried a large rectangular shield called a scutum, which covered most of his body. This shield was made of layers of wood covered with leather and canvas with a metal rim. It was heavy but offered exceptional protection. For offensive weapons, the legionary had 2 pilums, heavy javelins with iron tips designed to pierce shields and armor. After throwing his pilums, the legionary drew his gladius, a short sword about 2 feet long, designed for deadly thrusts in close combat. Roman equipment prioritized protection and versatility. With his large shield and armor, the legionary was well protected against frontal attacks. But he also had freedom of movement. He could fight effectively on uneven terrain, in confined spaces, or in open formation. The Roman formation did not require the same absolute coordination as the Macedonian phalanx. If a legionary fell, the man behind him could advance to fill the gap without endangering the entire formation. The Romans trained their soldiers to fight both in formation and individually, something the Phalangites simply did not do. But there was another crucial difference. The Romans developed a military culture based on iron discipline, individual courage, and absolute loyalty to the Republic. Their soldiers were trained not only to fight, but to build fortifications, march long distances carrying heavy equipment, and survive in harsh conditions. The Roman army on campaign was a complete mobile city, capable of building a fortified camp every night, even after an exhausting march. This combination of military and engineering skills made the Romans formidable foes in any prolonged campaign. During the 3rd century BC, Rome and the Hellenistic world remained largely separate, each focused on its own wars. Rome was fighting for survival against Carthage in the Punic Wars, while the Hellenistic kingdoms continued their endless dynastic disputes. But it was only a matter of time before these 2 spheres of influence collided, and when they did, the question would be decided. Whose military system was superior? The Macedonian phalanx with its long sarissas and impenetrable formation, or the Roman legion with its flexibility and adaptability? The first significant encounter occurred in 280 BC, when Rome engaged in a war in Illyria, on the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea. There, the Roman legions faced armies organized in the Hellenistic style for the first time. The results were inconclusive but worrying for the Romans. The phalanx proved to be a formidable force, especially in open terrain, but the Romans also noted vulnerabilities. The phalanx was powerful when it maintained its formation, but seemed less effective when that formation was disrupted. The true test would come a few years later when Rome would be drawn into conflict with the most powerful kingdom in the Hellenistic world. That kingdom was Macedonia, now ruled by Philip Fiffer, a direct descendant of the line that had created the phalanx. Philip was ambitious and viewed Roman influence in the eastern Mediterranean with alarm. He had even formed an alliance with Hannibal of Carthage during the Second Punic War, hoping that Rome would be destroyed by the Carthaginian general. But Rome survived and now turned its attention eastward, tensions between Rome and Macedonia escalated rapidly. Philip was aggressively expanding his power in Greece and the Aegean Sea, intimidating Greek city-states and threatening Rome's allies. Several Greek cities, including Athens and Rhodes, appealed to Rome for protection. The Roman Senate, always sensitive to threats against its allies and seeing an opportunity to extend its influence, decided to act. In 200 BC, Rome declared war on Macedonia. This would be called the Second Macedonian War, and it would determine whether Rome or Macedonia would dominate the eastern Mediterranean. The early years of the war were inconclusive. The Roman commander Publius Sulpicius Galba invaded Macedonia in 199 BC, but failed to force a decisive battle. Philip was an experienced general and avoided combat in unfavorable circumstances. He used Macedonia's mountainous terrain to his advantage, retreating when pressed and attacking when he saw opportunities. The Roman legions found themselves fighting in hostile country on unfavorable terrain against an enemy that refused to engage in decisive combat. But in 198 BC, Rome sent a new commander to Greece. His name was Titus Quinctius Flamininus, and he would be the man who would finally confront the legendary Macedonian Phalanx in decisive battle. Flamininus was one of the most brilliant aristocrats of his generation. He had served with distinction during the Second Punic War and was known for his intelligence, diplomacy, and military skill. At 32, he was exceptionally young to command a consular army, but the Senate recognized his talent and gave him command. Flamininus arrived in Greece with reinforcements and a plan. He understood that simply chasing Philip through the Macedonian mountains was a losing strategy. Instead, he began a combined diplomatic and military campaign. He courted the Greek city-states, presenting Rome as the liberator from Macedonian tyranny. Many cities, tired of Philip's rule, began to switch sides. At the same time, Flamininus pressed on militarily, invading Thessaly, the breadbasket of Macedonia. Philip realized he could no longer avoid battle. If he lost Thessaly, he would lose the ability to feed his army. He marched south with his entire army, determined to drive out the Romans. Both armies moved through Thessaly in the spring of 197 BC, searching for each other, each commander hoping to find a favorable location for battle. Fate would intervene in the hills near the town of Skotusa. The area was known as Cynoscephalai, meaning dogs' heads, in Greek because of the rocky hills that supposedly looked like dogs' heads when viewed from a distance. It was uneven terrain, with low hills and valleys. Not exactly the kind of location either commander would have chosen for battle. The phalanx worked best on flat terrain, where it could maintain its formation and advance in a straight line. The Roman legions, though more adaptable, still preferred more open terrain for their maneuvers. On the morning of 197 BC, a thick fog covered the Cynoscephalai hills. Neither commander knew exactly where the enemy army was. They had camped the night before, unaware of how close they were to each other. Philip sent a reconnaissance force of cavalry and light infantry to occupy the hilltops and gather information about the Roman position. Flamininus, operating under the same fog of uncertainty, also sent his own reconnaissance troops to the top of the mist-covered hills. These reconnaissance forces unexpectedly ran into each other. What began as a light skirmish quickly escalated. Both sides sent reinforcements. The Macedonian cavalry initially had the upper hand, pushing the Romans back, but Flamininus responded by sending more light troops and a few legionary maniples. The fighting on the hills intensified, turning from a skirmish into a serious engagement. Philip, upon receiving news of the engagement, faced a difficult decision. He was in a strong defensive position in his camp, and the uneven terrain was not ideal for his phalanx. But his men were engaged on the hilltops, and Macedonian pride would not allow him to abandon them. Moreover, if he could occupy the high ground, he would have an advantage over the Romans. Philip made his decision. He ordered his army to prepare for battle and began ascending the hills. The Macedonian phalanx began its ascent. Thousands of phalangites climbed the steep slope, carrying their heavy sarissas. It was grueling work. Maintaining formation while climbing a hill carrying a 20-foot spear required extraordinary physical effort, but the Macedonians were seasoned veterans. and they held their lines. At the top of the hills, the phalanx began to form. Philip's right wing reached the summit first and quickly formed into battle formation. The left wing was still climbing, stretched out and disorganized by the difficult climb. Flamininus, watching from the valley below, immediately recognized both the opportunity and the danger of his situation. The Macedonians were occupying the high ground, which would give them an advantage, but they were forming on uneven ground, and their army was divided, with half still climbing the hill. It was time to attack or retreat. Flamininus was too bold to retreat. He ordered his legions forward. The Roman army began to climb the hills toward the Macedonians. The maniples advanced in their characteristic formation, with gaps between each unit, allowing for flexibility and adaptation to the terrain. They climbed the slope in good order, their large rectangular shields raised, ready to face the long sarissas that awaited them at the summit. The battle was about to begin in earnest. Philip's right wing, fully formed on the hilltop, presented a terrifying sight. The first 5 rows of phalangites had their sarissas pointed forward, creating a wall of spearheads that stretched for yards in front of the first line of men. Behind them, another 11 rows held their sarissas at high angles, ready to advance. This was the formation that had conquered the known world. It was the perfect military machine created by Philip II and used by Alexander to defeat empires, and now it was positioned on high ground, ready to roll over the Romans like an avalanche of bronze and iron. Philip gave the order. The phalanx began to advance downhill. The weight and momentum of thousands of men descending a slope with 20-foot spears was devastating. The Roman maniples climbing the hill were struck as if by a hammer. The sarissas pierced shields and armor. The physical pressure of the descending phalanx simply pushed the Romans back. The legionaries fought bravely, but there was nothing they could do. You can't fight physics. The mass and momentum of the phalanx descending the hill was irresistible. The left wing of the Roman army began to fall apart. Entire maniples were pushed back, their formations shattered by the force of the impact. Men stumbled and fell, being trampled by the relentlessly advancing phalanx. The long sarissas kept the Romans at a distance where their gladiuses were useless. Every attempt to close the distance resulted only in more casualties. Soldiers who tried to get past or around the sarissas were immediately struck by multiple spears from different directions. It was like trying to fight a forest of metal spikes. Flamininus, watching his left wing collapse, must have felt a moment of pure terror. This was the phalanx that had conquered the world. This was the formation that had never been defeated in frontal combat, and now it was destroying his army. Historical accounts suggest that part of his army was on the verge of running away. If the men had started running, the battle would have ended in slaughter. Philip would have won, proving once again the supremacy of the Macedonian Phalanx. But while Philip's right wing was destroying the Romans with devastating success, the Macedonian left wing was still struggling to organize itself. Remember, the climb had been difficult, and this part of the Macedonian army was still arriving at the top of the hill, stretched out and disorganized. The phalanx required time to form properly. The phalangites needed to align their rows, adjust their spacing, and coordinate their sarissas. This usually took several minutes, and they didn't have those minutes. Flamininus saw his opportunity. While his left wing was being destroyed, the Roman right wing faced Macedonians who were not yet fully formed. With an instinct that separated great commanders from average ones, Flamininus made his decision in a split second. He ordered his right wing to attack immediately, before the Macedonians could complete their formation. 20 Roman maniples, approximately 2,400 men, advanced rapidly against the Macedonian left wing. The Macedonians desperately tried to form the phalanx. The phalangites rushed to their positions, raising their heavy sarissas, trying to create the wall of spears that was their protection. But they lacked space, lacked time, and were on uneven terrain that made perfect formation impossible. Some men's sarissas clashed with others. Gaps appeared in the lines. The perfect coordination that the phalanx required simply wasn't there. The Romans struck before the formation was complete, and when they did exactly what their training had prepared them for. The maniples didn't try to fight the sarissas head-on where they were longest. Instead, they moved around the sides and through gaps in the disorganized formation. They approached from the side, where the long sarissas could no longer reach them, and once they were close, the phalanx was virtually defenseless. Think about the Macedonian Phalangite's equipment. He carried a 20-foot sarissa that required both hands. His small shield was strapped to his forearm, offering minimal protection. He had no sword for close combat, or, if he did, it was a short weapon, not good for serious self-defense. The entire system depended on keeping the enemy away with the sarissa. Once the Roman legionaries were close, within range of the sarissas, the Phalangites were virtually defenseless. The Roman legionaries, on the other hand, were trained precisely for this type of combat. With their large scutum shields, they could block desperate attacks. With their gladius, they could deliver deadly stabs under enemy shields into exposed thighs, stomachs, and throats. In close combat, a well-trained legionary was devastating, and now there were hundreds of them among the disorganized Macedonians. The Macedonian left wing began to collapse. The Phalangites, unable to use their long sarissas effectively, began to retreat. Some dropped their sarissas and tried to fight with knives or bare hands, but against fully armed legionaries, they had no chance. The retreat quickly turned into a panicked flight. Men began running downhill, trying to escape the onslaught, but the Macedonian right wing still continued to advance victoriously, pushing the Romans back. Philip could still win the battle if he could completely break the Roman left wing before his own left wing collapsed. The battle had split into two separate fights, with each side winning one wing. The final outcome would depend on which collapse would be complete first. It was at this moment that something extraordinary happened, something that would demonstrate the true genius of the Roman military system. An unnamed Roman tribune commanding 20 maniples on the Roman right wing took an initiative that would change the course of the battle. Seeing that the Macedonian left wing was in complete flight, he made a decision on his own, without waiting for orders from Flamininus. Instead of chasing the fleeing Macedonians, which would have been the natural instinct, he rallied his maniples and led them in a movement that would demonstrate the superior flexibility of the Roman legions. He marched his 20 maniples across the hill, bypassing the center of the battle, and attacked the rear of the victorious Macedonian right wing. This was something the rigid structure of the phalanx simply could not do. The phalanx could only advance forward. It lacked the flexibility to change direction quickly, especially while engaged in frontal combat. But the Roman maniples were independent units that could maneuver separately. They could change direction, reform, and attack from new angles, all while maintaining their cohesion and combat effectiveness. The Macedonian right wing, which had been destroying the Romans in front of it, suddenly found itself attacked from behind. The confusion was instant. The phalanx was not designed to fight in two directions. The sarissas pointed forward against the enemy in front. There was no way to quickly turn them to face a new threat from behind. The Phalangites in the rear rows tried to turn, but it was virtually impossible. Imagine trying to turn while holding a 20-foot spear while squeezed between hundreds of other men doing the same. The sarissas collided with each other. The carefully maintained formation fell apart into chaos. The Roman legionaries attacked the exposed rear guard with brutal efficiency. They struck the Phalangites from behind and the sides, where they had no protection. Their small shields were useless against attacks from unexpected directions. The Phalangites tried desperately to reorganize, but the confusion was total. Some men tried to turn to face the new threat, further breaking the formation. Others continued pressing forward, still intent on destroying the Romans in front of them, unaware of the disaster unfolding behind them. The Macedonian right wing, which moments before had been on the verge of complete victory, was now being attacked from two sides at once. The Romans in front of them, who had been retreating, realized what was happening and renewed their attack with new energy. Pressed from front and rear, the Macedonian formation collapsed. The phalanx so powerful when intact and advancing in a straight line, became a disorganized mass of confused men fighting individually for survival. The collapse spread like a virus through the Macedonian ranks. Men began to drop their heavy sarissas, which were now more obstacles than weapons. Some tried to surrender, raising their hands. But in the chaos of battle, few Roman legionaries were willing to take prisoners. The Macedonian discipline, so impressive minutes before, evaporated completely. What had been a perfectly coordinated military machine became a mob of terrified individuals trying to escape. Philip, watching from his position, saw his army fall apart before his eyes. The Macedonian king was a brave soldier and had personally led many victorious charges in previous battles, but even he could see that the battle was lost. He gathered his royal guard and the remnants of his cavalry forces and tried to cover the retreat of as many of his men as possible. It was all he could do now. The battle had turned into a massacre. The Romans pursued the fleeing Macedonians across the Cynoscephalai hills. The uneven terrain that had been so challenging for the phalanx formation now prevented an organized escape. Groups of Macedonians were surrounded and destroyed. Others managed to escape in small groups, scattering across the countryside. As the sun began to set that spring afternoon, the battlefield was covered with dead and wounded. Ancient estimates suggest that the Macedonians lost about 8,000 men killed and 5,000 captured. Roman casualties were significantly lower, perhaps 700 dead, though ancient figures are always uncertain, but the actual numbers mattered less than what they represented. The Macedonian Phalanx, considered unbeatable for over a century, had been utterly defeated. The formation Alexander had used to conquer the known world had been shattered by a different military system. And it wasn't just luck or accident. It was the result of fundamental advantages the Roman legion held over the phalanx. Now we can finally fully reveal the secret weapon that destroyed the Macedonian phalanx. It wasn't a specific device or new technology. It wasn't a special type of sword or armor. The secret weapon was the Roman maniple system itself, the organization of the army into independent maniples that could maneuver separately while staying organized. It was flexibility, the ability to adapt to uneven terrain, the ability to respond quickly to changing situations. It was training that allowed a tribune to take the initiative and execute a complex maneuver without waiting for orders from the supreme commander. The phalanx was powerful, but it was also fundamentally rigid. It worked magnificently under ideal conditions: flat terrain, full formation, enemies attacking head-on. But when these conditions were not present, when the terrain was uneven, when the formation was disrupted, when attacks came from unexpected directions, the phalanx became vulnerable. And once its formation was broken, individual phalangites with their specialized equipment designed only for fighting in formation were largely defenseless. The Roman legion, on the other hand, was adaptable. Maniples could fight on uneven terrain, they could reform quickly after interruptions, they could maneuver independently to take advantage of opportunities or respond to threats. And individual legionaries were trained for combat in a variety of circumstances, not just fighting in rigid formation. With their large shields and gladiuses, they were effective both in formation and in individual combat. The Battle of Cynoscephalae demonstrated another Roman advantage: decentralized initiative. The tribune who attacked the Macedonian rearguard wasn't following a pre-made plan. He saw an opportunity and made a split-second decision. The Roman system encouraged and rewarded this kind of initiative. Mid-level commanders were trained to think tactically and make independent decisions. The Macedonian phalanx, on the other hand, relied on centralized command. It required perfect top-down coordination. When that coordination broke down, the entire system failed. There's also the issue of terrain. The Mediterranean world is mostly mountainous and uneven. There are relatively few places where large armies can meet on perfectly flat plains. The Macedonians and other Hellenistic armies always looked for such locations for their battles, because that's where the phalanx worked best. But you can't always choose where to fight. The Romans, with their more adaptable system, could fight effectively on a much wider range of terrain. After Cynoscephalai, the war continued for another year, but its outcome was already determined. Philip had lost his best army and lacked the resources to immediately build another. He was forced to accept humiliating peace terms. Macedonia had to withdraw from all Greek cities, surrender its fleet, pay a massive fine, and reduce its army to 5,000 men. The powerful kingdom that had dominated Greece for nearly a century and a half became a client state of Rome. But the history of the Macedonian Phalanx did not end with Cynoscephalai. There would be another, even more decisive test decades later. In 168 BC, Philip I's grandson Perseus tried to restore Macedonian greatness. He built another army based on the Phalanx and challenged Rome again. The Third Macedonian War reached its peak at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, where the Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus faced the renewed Macedonian Phalanx. The Battle of Pydna provided further confirmation of Cynoscephalai's lessons. Initially, the Macedonian Phalanx again demonstrated its terrifying power. Advancing on favorable terrain, it pushed the Roman legions back. Paulus, the Roman commander, would later admit that he had never seen anything as terrifying as the Macedonian Phalanx on the move. The wall of Sarissas seemed absolutely impenetrable. But as the battle progressed and the Phalanx advanced over more uneven terrain, gaps began to appear in its formation. The Roman maniples, with their characteristic flexibility, immediately took advantage of these gaps. Paulus ordered his maniples to attack through every gap in the Macedonian line. Once inside the formation, the legionaries repeated what they had done at Cynoscephalai. They massacred the defenseless phalangites in close combat. The phalanx fell apart, and Macedonia was utterly defeated. This time, Rome did not allow the Macedonian kingdom to exist as a client state. Macedonia was divided into 4 separate republics under Roman supervision and eventually became a Roman province. The kingdom that Philip II had built, which Alexander had used to conquer the world, ceased to exist. Other Hellenistic kingdoms learned the lesson. The Seleucid Empire, which controlled much of the ancient Persian Empire, also based its army on the Macedonian Phalanx. When it clashed with Rome, a few decades after Cynoscephalai, at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, the outcome was similar. The Seleucid Phalanx, even supported by war elephants, scythed chariots, and superior numbers, was defeated by the Roman legions. The pattern was becoming clear. Armies organized in the Hellenistic style simply could not consistently defeat the Roman legions. It's important to recognize that the phalanx was not inherently inferior in every way. In ideal terrain, fully formed, advancing against enemies attacking head-on, it was still incredibly powerful. Its superior range and striking power were real. The problem was that war rarely occurred under ideal conditions. Battles took place on uneven terrain. Formations were disrupted by terrain. Enemies attacked from unexpected directions. And under these more realistic conditions, the flexibility of the Roman legion proved more valuable than the phalanx's raw power. There were also broader factors at play. The Roman military system was part of a larger political and social system that gave Rome long-term strategic advantages. Rome had a large citizen population that could be drafted into the army. The Republic could absorb defeats and quickly build new armies, as it had demonstrated during the Punic Wars against Hannibal. The Hellenistic kingdoms, ruled by narrow dynasties with often unhappy populations, lacked the same strategic resilience. Rome was also better at bringing conquered peoples into its system. Italian allies provided auxiliary troops that significantly increased Roman military power. Over time, many of these allies would become full Roman citizens, further strengthening the state. The Hellenistic kingdoms, on the other hand, remained essentially empires of conquest, with a Macedonian or Greek ruling elite governing native populations that remained culturally distinct and often resentful. Roman discipline and engineering also gave them advantages in prolonged campaigns. The Roman army could operate far from home for years, building fortifications establishing supply lines, and besieging fortified cities. Hellenistic armies excelled in decisive battles, but were less effective in prolonged operations. This distinction became increasingly important as wars became long-term strategic conflicts rather than single battles. Cynoscephalai marked a turning point in military and political history. It demonstrated that the military system that had dominated for over a century and a half could be defeated. It showed that military innovation had not ended with Alexander. New organizations, new tactics, and new systems could emerge and overcome even the most established forces. Military history, like all history, is not static. What works in one era may become outdated in the next. For Macedonia and the Hellenistic world, Cynoscephalai marked the beginning of the end. Although the Hellenistic kingdoms continued to exist for another century and a half, their true political independence had ended. They gradually became satellites of Rome until finally being absorbed directly into the Roman Empire. The last independent Hellenistic kingdom, Ptolemaic Egypt, fell in 30 BC when Octavian, the future Augustus, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. With this conquest, the entire Hellenistic world was under Roman control. For Rome, Cynoscephalai was a validation of its military system and the beginning of its dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. In the following decades, Rome would extend its power over all of Greece, Macedonia, Asia Minor, and eventually the entire Mediterranean. The Roman legion, refined through centuries of constant warfare in Italy, and proven against the legendary Macedonian Phalanx, would become the dominant military force for nearly 5 centuries. The battle also has lessons for us today. It demonstrates the importance of flexibility over rigidity in organizational systems. The Macedonian Phalanx was powerful but overly specialized. It worked magnificently under specific conditions but failed when those conditions were not present. The Roman legion, less impressive in any single area but adaptable and flexible, proved superior in a wider range of situations. This is a lesson that applies not only to militaries but to organizations, businesses, and systems of all kinds. Cynoscephalai also demonstrates the value of decentralized initiative. The Roman tribune who attacked the Macedonian rearguard wasn't following orders. He saw an opportunity and acted. The Roman system allowed and encouraged this kind of decision-making at the mid-level. This gave the Roman army a responsiveness and adaptability that more centralized armies couldn't match. Again, this is a lesson that goes beyond the specific military context. The battle also reminds us that technological or tactical advantages are not permanent. The Macedonian Phalanx was the most advanced military technology of its time when it was developed in the 4th century BC. For more than a century, it gave the Macedonian and Hellenistic armies decisive superiority, but other powers studied, adapted, and eventually developed systems that could defeat it. No advantage lasts forever. Innovation is an ongoing process, not a one-time event. It is also fascinating to think about the individuals involved. Flamininus, the Roman commander, was only 32 years old when he commanded at Cynoscephalai. He was bold enough to attack even when circumstances were less than ideal, but also flexible enough to adapt his tactics when his troops encountered the phalanx on favorable terrain. Philip V, the Macedonian king, made the difficult decision to fight on unfavorable terrain because he could not abandon his already engaged troops. It was an understandable choice from a military leadership perspective, but it ultimately proved disastrous. The unnamed Roman tribune who led the decisive maneuver demonstrated the kind of tactical initiative that characterized Roman leadership at its best. These individual decisions, made in moments of extreme stress, determined the outcome not only of the battle, but of centuries of subsequent history. We must also think about the ordinary soldiers who fought on both sides. The Macedonian Phalangites were seasoned professionals, many of whom had served for years. They trained extensively to fight in their specialized formation. When this formation worked, they were virtually invincible. But when it failed, they found themselves defenseless, wielding weapons they could not use effectively against enemies within their own defenses. The terror they must have felt when the Roman legionaries broke their lines and attacked from directions they had no defense against must have been absolute. The Roman legionaries also deserve our respect. Charging uphill against the Macedonian Phalanx in full formation required extraordinary courage. Seeing that wall of spears coming down toward you, knowing that dozens of metal points were aimed specifically at you, and still continuing to advance requires a kind of courage that is difficult to imagine. And when the opportunity came to flank the phalanx, the Romans had the discipline and training to execute complex maneuvers amid the chaos of battle. Cynoscephalai also makes us question assumptions. For over a century, everyone assumed that the Macedonian phalanx was unbeatable in frontal combat. It had defeated all enemies. It had conquered empires. Surely nothing could stop it. But this assumption proved false. The phalanx had vulnerabilities that simply hadn't been taken advantage of until it met an enemy with the right system to exploit them. How many other assumptions in our own lives and times might be similarly false, waiting just for the right test to be overturned? The battle took place over 2,000 years ago, but its echoes still resonate. When we study military history today, when we analyze tactics and strategies, Cynoscephalai is always a fundamental case study. It is taught in military academies around the world as an example of how flexibility overcomes rigidity, how tactical initiative can change battles, and how terrain conditions affect combat outcomes. The lessons remain relevant even in an era of radically different military technology. For the broader history of Western civilization, Cynoscephalai was a defining moment. Had Macedon won, had the phalanx proved its superiority once again, history would have taken a very different course. Rome might have been driven from Greece, its eastward expansion stopped. The Hellenistic world might have consolidated under renewed Macedonian leadership. Instead, Rome emerged as the dominant power, and it was Rome, not Macedon, that would form the Roman Empire. That would be the political foundation of the Mediterranean world for centuries. It was under Roman, not Hellenistic rule, that Christianity would emerge and spread. It was Roman law, not Macedonian law, that would form the basis of Western legal systems. The consequences of that single battle ripple through all subsequent history. So when we ask what was the secret weapon that destroyed the Macedonian phalanx, the answer is complex and has many parts. At the most basic level, it was the manipular organization of the Roman legion, which allowed for flexibility that the phalanx could not match. It was Roman training that produced soldiers capable of fighting effectively both in formation and individually. It was Roman equipment, the scutum and gladius, which were effective in close combat where the sarissa was useless. It was Roman military culture that encouraged initiative at mid-level command. It was Rome's strategic resilience that allowed it to absorb setbacks and keep fighting. But at a deeper level, the secret weapon was adaptability. The phalanx was a specialized system optimized for specific conditions. The Roman legion was a more generalized system, effective in a wider range of conditions. In a complex and unpredictable world, adaptability proved more valuable than specialized excellence. This may be the most profound lesson of Cynoscephalai. It is not the strongest that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the most adaptable to change. The Macedonians built the most powerful military system of their era. But when circumstances changed, when they faced a new type of enemy on a new type of terrain, their system could not adapt quickly enough. The Romans, with their more flexible system, were able to adapt and win. On the Cynoscephalai hills, on that spring morning in 197 BC, two military systems collided. One represented the peak of Hellenistic military art, refined over generations and proven by countless victories. The other represented a different approach, developed through centuries of brutal warfare in Italy, tested against diverse enemies on varied terrain. When the fog lifted and the battle ended, the more adaptable system had won. And in that victory, the course of Western history was decided. Rome, not Macedonia, would inherit the Mediterranean world. The legion, not the phalanx, would be the dominant military formation for centuries to come, and the lessons learned on those rocky hills would continue to inform military and organizational thought to this day. This is the story of the Battle of Cynoscephalae, where the secret weapon of flexibility destroyed the seeming invincibility of the Macedonian Phalanx, and where the future of Western civilization was forged in the fires of combat. As we reflect on these monumental events that shaped our civilization, we are reminded that behind every battle, every human decision, every moment that changes the course of history, there is a greater providence. Men plan their strategies, build their weapons, and march to war. But it is the Lord God who, in His infinite wisdom, guides the destinies of nations. May we learn not only the tactical and strategic lessons of these great battles, but also recognize the humility necessary before the mysteries of history and life. Thank you for following this journey through one of the most decisive moments in ancient military history. May God bless each of you.